Hello folks, welcome back. Let's take a few moments to think about the idea of information and the way in which information flow is important for living things. Now, for proper cell and organism function, what we have to have is some mechanism to store information, to access that information, get at it somehow, and then to transmit it, maybe from one cell to another or from one generation to another. And also think of the way in which we might use information as a way to communicate between organisms or between cells of an organism. So there's going to be lots of opportunities this semester for us to find examples of the way in which information flows in living things. Now, information is utilized by organisms. We want to think of it as primarily a chemical form of information. And one of the topics that I'm going to repeatedly talk about over and over again this semester is the idea that the shape, the organization, the pattern of the building blocks of molecules is the information. So notice I'm talking about chemical information, and I'm talking about the structure of the chemicals as being how the information is stored. Now, we'll expand on this idea quite a bit as we go into other topic areas and other chapters, but right now you just want to begin to think about this idea of chemical information and find examples of it as we go through future chapters. Now, one of the key ways in which information is stored and utilized in cells is in the form of nucleic acids. We're going to have a couple different opportunities this semester to talk about DNA and RNA molecules. And when we talk about living things, we're going to talk about DNA as their primary information molecule. It's the key information molecule that is used for storing information in living things, in the cells of organisms. Now, we'll also find that RNA might be used as an information molecule as well. It's another type of nucleic acid. And we're even going to find that in viruses, that RNA molecules are their primary information storage molecule. Now, within the cell, this DNA information has to be able to be copied. And so one of the things we're going to talk about is how that DNA information is duplicated. How does it get copied so that it can be passed on to future generations of cells? Matter of fact, we'll talk about this copying and transmission process of DNA information as a key component of the ideas related to heredity. We're going to have a number of chapters that are going to deal with different aspects of genetics, how information is passed from one generation of organisms to the next generation, how information is going to be passed from one cell to another cell as that cell multiplies and divides. So we're going to see this idea of duplicating information in the form of DNA and then passing it on to future generations of cells and organisms. Key component of something we'll talk about, and we'll better understand how that information is stored and how it also is duplicated as we get into later chapters. But it is a key feature of those things we think of as being alive, living things. Now, the DNA of the cell, not only is it an important information storage molecule, but we use it as a source of information that we can retrieve, that we can take information from. What we're going to find is that the DNA information, as we access it, as a cell makes use of it, that it's going to be the information that allows the cell to regulate and control, influence its structure and function. Now, we think of the units of information that are stored in DNA as genes, and we'll talk about this idea. We'll talk about the idea of these packages of information that are found in the DNA of organisms, the genes of an organism, as having stored information that can be retrieved. I like to think of them as recipes. Think of your Betty Crocker cookbook that you might have at home. It's full of information, stored information. And as I go into it, I can copy portions of that information, a particular recipe, apple pie. We can think of genes in a similar way. Now, it's not an exact analogy, of course, but you want to think of it as the DNA as being a master, a large recipe file for the cell that has information that's in units that we call genes, and that we're going to retrieve that information and make use of it to carry out functions in the cell. Now, how does that happen? Well, The genes themselves, these recipes that I'm talking about, are information for how the cell is going to make proteins. And we're going to see that proteins are really the workhorses of the cell. Proteins do so many things in the cell that you're going to find that virtually every chapter we talk about this semester, I'm going to be focused on protein function. Now, the way in which proteins function is due to the shape, the makeup, the components that they're built out of. Well, how do I determine what those components are going to be? How does the cell know what building blocks to use to make a particular protein, to give it a particular shape, to let it have a particular informational function? Well, that's the information that's stored in the genes. So we're going to take a look at that process of how do I retrieve information from the DNA genes, use that to instruct the machinery of the cell to build particular proteins, and then those proteins are going to be what are the key components of the cell that influence its coordinated activities. We're going to talk about so many different functions of a cell, and in every case we're going to talk about the proteins that are involved in regulating, influencing, controlling, carrying out that particular function of the cell. Proteins are intimately involved in every activity of the cell, and we're going to see that that is the, you could think of it as the most important molecular component of the cell in terms of everyday coordinated function, activity, structural features of a cell. Of course, if all those proteins are the result of information from the DNA, you can see why people say that DNA is the information, is the control molecule of the cell. The DNA doesn't necessarily control the cell directly, but it does have the information for making the proteins, which are the day in and day out control molecules of the cell. We'll spend a lot of time talking about that idea this semester. Now, we said that information flow is going to be chemical information, and so I want you to also be thinking about the idea of chemical messenger molecules. So beside the use of DNA as an information storage molecules, we want to think about the ways in which the cells of my body communicate with each other. Or what about the members of a bacterial population where one bacterial cell is communicating with other bacterial cells? When we talk about the ideas of communication between organisms, between the cells of an organism, or between single-celled organisms, in all of those cases it's going to involve some component of chemical information. So you can see that when we talk about communication, we're going to be talking about chemical messenger systems. So we might be talking about, for example, in my body, the information I want to send from a nerve cell to a muscle cell. My nerve cell influencing the muscle cell to contract and carry out some activity. We're going to find that that's chemical messenger system. Chemicals released by one cell influencing another cell. Well, what about my endocrine system? My pituitary gland or my thyroid gland, the glands of my body that influence the function of organs, other cells and tissues in my body. How does that happen? Chemical messengers. Now, we're going to not specifically talk about endocrine system this semester, but you'll see that we'll talk about ideas related to the way in which the endocrine system functions. And if you have taken an A&P course already, or if you're going to be taking an A&P course, you'll realize the importance of those key messenger molecules for the coordination and regulation of bodily functions. What about my immune system? My immune system has to be able to recognize foreign materials, has to be able to gain access to information about what are my cells and what aren't my cells. The cells of my immune system have to be able to talk to each other at a chemical level, where one cell, because of the chemicals it is releasing or the chemicals that are present on its surface, cause other cells to have certain actions, to do certain things. The chemicals on the surface of these immune system cells also are very important in triggering the destruction of foreign materials. But there's going to be this constant chemical communication that occurs between the cells of the immune system. I mentioned bacterial populations, and sometimes we tend to think of them as being so simplistic that they don't have these kinds of coordinated activities, but bacterial populations are constantly sending chemical information to each other, constantly relating information. talking to each other, so to speak. In some cases, one type of bacterial cell releases chemicals that encourages other cells to come to its location, to interact with it, to join with it in a community interaction. In some cases, a cell is releasing chemicals that warns other cells away, that keeps them at a distance. Information between cells. Notice, not just in a multicellular organism like me, but also between single-celled organisms in a population. One of the other things we're going to see, and this is going to be an important topic that we'll talk about, and you're going to find that I have another video that focuses on this idea of change, is that one of the key components of what cells do as they communicate to each other is they influence cells to change in some way. That information molecules from generation to generation change over time. We'll talk about how DNA or RNA molecules go through the process of mutation, changing from one period of time to the next. And so a key feature of this information flow is going to be the idea that this information can change the activity of cells, can influence the development, growth of cells, and that we would expect this information to be changing over time. So when you get a chance to watch my video dealing with the ideas related to evolutionary theory, you're going to see that I then take this idea of information and informational change and expand on it to a much greater degree. Spend some time this semester to think about how information is being exchanged. Think about the information at the chemical level, how the shape, the form, the structure of molecules can be thought of as stored information. Well, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you next time.